Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of the Hindu analysis today, we will be discussing 6 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, as always, the offer of 24,999 is going to end today at 11:59 p.m. So your window of opportunity to join our course and the new batches which are coming through for economics, which will start on 4th October, this is the right time. With this, let's look at the topics which we are going to discuss. The first one is about the concept of common practice. Very interesting articles and generally quite important for GS paper 3, a lot of terminologies. Then a very interesting data point on what has been the achievement of Make in India. Then we'll talk about the summit which recently happened with regards to the UN, the mad doctrine of Russia, and two small topics, one dealing with Chinese stance on Lebanon, what we discussed yesterday, and Greece and India cooperation over military and strategic partnerships. Now, a lot of you yesterday commented in the comment section, and you can always do that. You can ask us to repeat certain sections or do a specific section. And a lot of you asked me that, can you, sir, explain what is reverse auction? So, before I go into the first topic, I'll continue what we did yesterday with regards to Tirupati Laddus. We talked about the AR Dairy winning the reverse auction. I'll explain the concept to you so that you can benefit from that concept itself, and then we'll move into the topics for today. Now, the concept of reverse auction can be understood through this basic infograph. See, the word reverse itself should be enough, and I hope auctioning is something, what is called nilami, is something which you already know. Auction would be the concept of bidding to get the tender or the contract. But in forward auction, what happens is that there is a single seller and there are multiple buyers. And what happens is, in a forward auction or a bidding, here the prices start to go up because the supply is limited and the demand is quite high. And therefore, this is a standard procedure which you will see in, for example, the artifacts, or if a house is being in a way bidded out or auctioned out by the banks once it is seized by a defaulter. That is where the concept of forward auction comes in. Too many buyers but one single seller. Reverse auction is the exact opposite, what mostly the government does, being the single biggest buyer or single most buyer in India. It's called reverse auction. The government of India buys a lot of things from the market. So therefore, it becomes the single buyer. And then we have multiple suppliers. Here the demand remains the same, supply is quite high, and therefore the prices start to go down. And this is where the concept of reverse auction comes in. The Tirupati Laddu ghee acquisition happened through the reverse auction process, where the TTD said that we want, for example, 1 lakh liters of ghee, and this is our demand, and we are the single largest buyer of ghee as of right now. And thereafter, you had Nandini, you had Amul, you had AR Dairy. They all were bidding for getting that 1 lakh tender. And therefore, what this does is it brings prices down. If Nandini had said 600 rupees per kg, Amul had said 1000, they said 320 rupees, and that is where they got the tender, which automatically means that in reverse auction, there is a chance for cutting corners and adulteration. This was the point which was made yesterday, and just to clarify, and as a lot of you commented about this, reverse auction is something which is followed by the government. Now, the whole concept of GEM, which is called Government E-Marketplace, is also based on reverse auction only. I want 3 computers, I will say I want 3 computers, and now 3 computers bid will come through the GEM portal to the department which is trying to procure these 3 what we call as computers. In most cases, what happens is substandard quality things can come through, but that is where the government rationalizes its expenditure, trying to get the price at the lowest possible mark. So this is the concept of reverse and forward auction. This is just called an auction, and this is called a reverse auction. Now, and we tend to call this tendering also. You would have heard this for sure, that tender has come out for something. Government does this for most of the things, from Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan to the concept of even midday meals. Everywhere tendering is a standard procedure. With this, let's go into the first topic, which is related to agroforestry. Now, there are 3 aspects to this article. First is, we need to understand what is agroforestry. That is the static portion, which I'll explain to you. Then it talks about climate finance, and within climate finance, the concept of common practice. This is where the question becomes quite interesting, and for you this word can come through in the examination, common practice. And thereafter last is the need to revisit the concept of common practice. So, these are the three components in which we will work. Now, the first and foremost point is what is agroforestry, as it means agriculture plus forest equals to agroforestry. But I want to be more specific, and that is why I have this infograph. You will get this PDF, a lot of you again commented on this, in the Telegram group after the session is over. Yesterday's is going to be also uploaded today. Now, there are three components to agroforestry, which is agriculture plus forestry, crops, trees and livestock, meaning you add all the basic components of agriculture, which is crops, trees and livestock together to create a complex which is called agroforestry. Now, agroforestry can be of three types. One is called agri-silviculture, which is crop plus the trees. Then you have silvopastoral, which is pasture, livestock plus trees, and you have agro-silvopastoral, which is crop, pasture, tree. Basically, if it is tree plus crop, it is agri-silviculture, silvi and agri. Thereafter, if it is trees plus pastures for grazing, then it is silvopastoral. And if you have forest plus crop plus grazing land or pastoral, it is all three, agro, silvo, pastoral. It is quite self-explanatory. Break it down and you will automatically understand it. And for agroforestry, there are three basic attributes which are taken into consideration, which is productivity should increase, sustainability of the land itself, and it can adapt to the practices which are there. Now, there are certain trees which are quite, you can say, suitable for rain-fed areas, for the saline areas, for example, neem, eucalyptus. That is a separate issue altogether. That is not what we are here for. But the idea is you understand that there are three types of agroforestry. And just to give you an example, I again have an infograph of how agroforestry can work together. For example, you can have one sector of your land which is silvopastoral, which is you have trees, along with that you have open pastures in which the livestock can graze. Therefore, silvopastoral, the what we call as the trees plus pastures for the livestock. But you can also have trees integrated as windbreaks, as what we call as riparian forest, which stop soil erosion, and you can also have a sector in which they are integrated into a certain complex in which you have a silvo agri sector, which is the trees plus the crop. So, this is how you basically break 2 to 3 basic problems of agriculture. See, this will allow you to stop soil erosion, it will increase productivity. In most cases, it allows pests to also not infest the agricultural space, and therefore, there are the following 6 to 7 important benefits. First is trees can produce fodder for the livestock. Second, it preserves the soil fertility because the leaves will decompose back into the land and therefore add back the organic elements. Third, it gives more CO2, it gives more oxygen and absorbs more CO2, which would be good for the productivity of the crop itself. Fourth would be the tree itself can be used for firewood as a byproduct. Thereafter, the fruits are a good byproduct of agroforestry. Thereafter, shade, which brings down the temperature and gives livestock and humans a little bit of respite, and nitrogen fixing and soil erosion being the 7th and 8th most important features. This is very important, nitrogen fixation and soil erosion. Because of the roots of the tree, soil erosion is in a way deaccelerated or in a way dampened. This is a very standard thing which happens through agroforestry. These are the basic. You can use this as benefits of agroforestry, and this can come and has come previously in the examination with regards to what is the importance of agroforestry in prelims examination has also come through. This is the static portion. This is expected from you to be known, but I am again repeating it because we go from 0 to 100. So, agroforestry, agriculture per forest, we have 3 basic categories in it, and thereafter we have the following benefits, 8 important benefits mostly related to a whole ecosystem which is created around agroforestry. Now, the topic or the article is not about agroforestry itself, it is about agroforestry and climate finance. Now, it gives a lot of interesting data about how agroforestry can be a game changer for India itself, and it argues that agroforestry sector is a very important you can say space in which ARR can happen, which is afforestation, reforestation and revegetation, which is called ARR initiatives. Under ARR, you can add a lot of carbon credit and carbon finance concept comes through. Now, climate finance is based on the concept of carbon finance, and the idea is the more you sequester means more you take out from the atmosphere and add it into the soil or into any carbon sink, which is a tree itself, which could be the organic element in soil. That is something which can be seen as a carbon credit. Carbon credit is the unit of carbon removed from the atmosphere as a form of sequestration and added into a carbon sink. The oceans are a carbon sink, the forests are a carbon sink. One of the most easiest carbon sinks to be produced is the forest itself. You have the soil as a carbon sink. We have man-made carbon sinks also being now created through sequestration being pushed into carbon blocks, which are now pushed into the crevices of the landforms itself. That's a separate issue altogether, but the idea is agroforestry can be a very important element in carbon finance. And the data which is in a way quite encouraging and important for you is that India has the potential of increasing from 28 million hectares to 53 million hectares of agroforestry in India by 2050. But what is more important is, though India has only 8.65% of its total land under agroforestry, 19 to 20% of its carbon sinks are in these agroforests. And therefore, if India wants sustainable development, what we call as ecological balance and economic development going forward, agroforestry could play a very important role. And we can additionally add 2.5 billion tons of carbon by 2030 in the carbon sinks of agroforest. Carbon sink is anything which holds carbon, sequestration is the process itself, carbon dioxide is in the air, which is a greenhouse gas. Now, this is where the link has been created that agroforestry has a very important sectoral, what we call as contribution to sustainability in India, and agroforestry can be the game changer. So, therefore, India should in a way invest in agroforestry. But this topic actually does not talk about that. The first part was what is agroforestry, I hope that is sorted. The second part is how the article is linking the concept of climate finance and agroforestry, because there is afforestation, ARR activities related to agroforestry. Therefore, food production and forest or afforestation can come together and create a very important space. Now, here the concept of climate based carbon credit is under scrutiny. Carbon credit, as I told you, is any credit you gain by sequestering carbon into a sink. Now, in order to determine that a certain practice is doing something good for the environment, that activity or process should not be common practice. Now, this is a very important word which has come into vogue for us, which is the concept of common practice. Now, what do you mean by common practice? See, if in India there is a practice of planting the wheat in the middle of the land and the process of having trees added on the corners. And this is a practice which is done by everybody in a certain sector, then it becomes common practice. Now, in this context, the carbon credit will not be given because it is a common practice which is followed. It is not something additional. Now, for example, if a farmer was following this pattern of having trees and the wheat crop in the middle, however, he also starts to line his land with forests, then that is an additional concept. It is other than the common practice, and therefore, for this additional aspect, he may get carbon credit. So, for anything which you do other than common practice is basically considered to be eligible for carbon credit. And this is where the concept of climate finance has created a problem for India. So, common practice is a key criteria used to assess if a project is additional to what is typically done in that region. If something is typically done, it will not give you the carbon credit in carbon finance concept itself. Now, the problem is that in India, we do agroforestry, but we do it in a scattered manner, we do it in unconventional ways, but more than that, somehow because of the definition which has been pushed through by the what we call as climate finance agencies, which is based on either African or Latin American or American models. In India, even agroforestry which is done additionally is considered common practice. And therefore, what the problem is that we have either a Eurocentric or an American centric. We have an American centric or a Eurocentric as everything. We have a Eurocentric or American centric common practice definition. And this becomes the problem. The current definition does not take into criteria the way India does its agriculture. Because in Latin America, in Africa and in the United States, large scale agricultural practices are followed, and India 86% of all Indian farmers are marginalized or small holders with less than 2 hectares of land. They are in a way doing agroforestry in a non-systematic scattered manner. However, that is not considered agroforestry because of the definition itself. So, let us bring the 3 concepts together. Agroforestry, as we know, is the concept of doing agriculture and forestry together to gain fertility and for sustainability. Then comes the concept that agroforestry automatically becomes eligible for carbon credit, but then this carbon credit will only be given to you if it is not common practice in that area, meaning it is something additionally being done as agroforestry. And because this definition is based on large holdings which are quite common in these sectors, and therefore, it does not define the way India does its agriculture, which is 86% in small and marginal, our farmers are not getting any form of carbon credit. Meaning that in India, if we want to integrate agroforestry with climate finance, in turn leading to farmers getting carbon credit, we need to change the definition of common practice. And this is what the article is actually talking about. If you look at it, common practice standards must have an India outlook. And this is the basic premise of this article, and quite an interesting one, that we need to redefine, and this is what is the need of the hour. We need to redefine the concept of carbon common practice, and that should be geared for the Indian conditions, for the Indian context, and that will allow income diversity. It will allow for income, additional income, and creating or creation of carbon sinks, of creation of carbon, one second, carbon sinks. And these three practices can be done only if the farmer is incentivized to do agroforestry because he gets carbon credit. And this is where we are now in a loop. Because common practice does not define what is agroforestry in India as additional, our farmers do not get any carbon credit, and with no carbon credit, what happens is they are discouraged to do agroforestry, and when they are discouraged to do agroforestry, it becomes a fragmented landscape of agroforestry, which adds to the process of common practice definition not being India centric. What we have to do is we have to break this cycle, and how we break this cycle is we change the definition of common practice. We then add incentives for our farmers to do agroforestry because they get carbon credit. Once they get carbon credit, they will also be able to diversify their income. Additional income will be there and carbon sinks will be produced. The farmer therefore gets incentivized, and this adds to our what we call as economic and environmental sustainability. This is a very important concept. So, we are caught up in this vicious cycle, we are caught up in, we need to change it, and this is basically the main gist of the article itself. And if you want to see what type of a question can be made out of it, is something like this. To unlock our agroforestry potential, we need to redefine common practice in the realm of carbon finance. Do you agree? Now, if you see this type of a question in the examination and you have no idea whatsoever about this article, this specific article, you will never be able to figure out what does this word common practice actually mean, because you will tend to go into the concept of common practice within agriculture or in forestry, but it is talking about common practice within carbon finance. And this is where the concept of anything which is typical to a region is common practice, therefore no carbon credit. And this is where this type of a flowchart, a mind map, can help you in a way to solve the issues which can come in the examination. And this is why this article is quite interesting that way, because it is linking a static portion of agroforestry with the concept of climate finance, with the concept of how we can change the cycle. And please do learn this terminology now, common practice, add it to your notes, because this could be a potential question for GS paper 3. Simple, straightforward topic, and I hope now agroforestry, climate finance, carbon credit and the concept of common practice is sorted for you. With this, we move to the second article, which is even more interesting, and it talks about a very interesting aspect which is used in history, which is deindustrialization, the structural transformation what we discuss in class, and it gives you a very gloomy picture. I am not the one who is endorsing this, it's data point. R. Nagaraj is the one who has written this. There is a very interesting line which is written, which may be problematic for the examination, but it is about ease of doing business. Let us try to analyze what this data point article from the Hindu tries to argue. Now, this article says that when 10 years back, it has been a decade, on 25th September 2014, the government of India, when it introduced Make in India, it had two objectives. The first objective was increase the GDP share of manufacturing or secondary sector from 14 to 15% to 25%. So, the idea was 10% increase in GDP. They did not talk about GVA, and at that point of time the base year was 2004, 2005. This should be noted because the 14-15% at that point of time was based on a base year of 2004-2005. Today we follow 2011-2012 base year, which was recently changed. Thereafter it also said that it wants to create additionally from 60 million people who are about in a way going to get employment or are engaged in industrial jobs, make it 100 million. So, to create 100 million additional jobs from about 60 million, which automatically would have got created by 2025. So 2025 is next year. Now, according to this, Make in India has always been a very important flagship program of the government. And we linked Make in India MI with the concept of ease of doing business. Ease of doing business index. You would have heard about this for sure. Reports and indices, ease of doing business. This was considered the marker. India was above 150 in its ranking. Now we are within 100, 63 is our rank. So, if our ease of doing business index ranking has improved from somewhere like a 143 to 63, there should be some tangible impact we should see either in GDP or in gross value addition GVA or in employment at least. Somewhere or the other we should see some form of impact, because if ease of doing business tells us India is the best place to, in a way as of right now in Asia, a very important place of investment and to do your business, make in India, and that is the new India. One thing more important is that, see, population engaged in agriculture should automatically reduce, and or rather there should be relative movement of population out of agriculture into industries, and that is what is going to be seen as a marker of industrialization. Now, before I go into the data, I want to discuss a point with you, and that point is called structural transformation. This is a point or a concept which I discuss in both world history and in modern India. It's a term which has been given by a historian called Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, and it comes out of the Marxian understanding of industrialization. And structural transformation is a word which is used to indicate industrial revolution. See, people tend to argue that industrial revolution is when the secondary sector starts to outperform the primary sector. This you will find in every basic source. It will say when the manufacturing sector outperforms in GDP performance to the agricultural sector, it means that we are industrializing. But that does not mean that it is an industrial revolution, it only means that you are industrializing, which is that your GDP contribution of secondary is much higher than your primary sector. Now, to make an industrialization into an industrial revolution, you need structural transformation. Structural transformation is when there is relative movement of population out of agriculture to industries, which is called rural to urban migration, and the word structural transformation is for basically the population data, structurally transforming the way our economy works and our population is placed. For example, in 2010 and in 2024, primary secondary sector, if in the primary sector you had 1 lakh men employed, secondary sector it was 20,000 for example, and now you have 20,000 here and 1 lakh here. This is called structural transformation, that 80,000 people moved out of the primary sector to go into secondary sector, and this is where you actually say that the industrial revolution is happening. India has never gone through industrial revolution itself. India is industrialized, but no industrial revolution, because in India what is common is the concept of single male circular migration, which is people moving out of agriculture, going to the industries, then coming back to agriculture. Single male family stays in the what we call as the agriculture sector. This is called a perpetual state of structural transformation in which India has been caught up since independence, and it's a colonial hangover. It is something which we should have removed by this point of time, but we haven't. So, India, rather than becoming from a secondary economy, moved to a tertiary economy, and we are a tertiary based economy, service sector based economy, and that is where the structural transformation aspect never came through or was not needed also. Now, the article uses this word, structural transformation, and I hope now you will know what it means. I will discuss this further when we talk about that data. Now, India has never gone through structural transformation. Nobody can argue that, but at least with ease of doing business index improvements, we should see some tangible improvements in our data. Now, the first graph tells us that in real gross value addition, the growth rate of the manufacturing sector, and according to the NAS data, National Account Statistics data, has reduced from 8.1% to 5.5%, which means that between 2001 and 12, for these 12 years, 8.1 was the GVA growth rate, and from 2012 to 2023, it was 5.5%. Now, the argument may be, which the government may say, is COVID. They would say 2019, 2020 and 2021, at least till 2022, we see a certain impact of COVID. However, even though they changed the base year from 2004 to 2004 and 5 to 2011 and 12, the data actually doesn't show any form of even uptick, little bit of uptick, and was even flat before COVID came through. Meaning this decrease is quite sharp, which is close to 3%. However, the decrease was close to 1.5% even before COVID came through. So, GVA manufacturing sector addition growth was something which has remained more or less flat or negative. But what is more problematic is if you look at the population and the GDP constant price, in a way contribution data, meaning manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. This shows that there has not been even 1% increase in the past 3 decades of the GDP contribution of manufacturing. In this, you can't talk about COVID because it talks about 3 decades. Yes, the previous governments did not do anything, but in the past one decade, there should have been certain increase. Again, the argument can be that whatever increase was there, COVID neutralized it, but that is something which we presume from the government. But the idea is GDP data as of right now is little bit higher because of change of base year. However, it has been stagnated at the 15 to 17% mark. It has never crossed the 17% mark or the 18% mark, which means that the 25% is not going to ever be met. But what is more concerning is, and again the argument can be COVID, but it actually makes no sense to argue in that same line, is that the NSSO data tells us that the employment in the industrial sector has declined from 12 to 11% in 2022-23, which is now a recovery phase rather than a phase in which we see an impact of COVID. And further, what is more problematic is agriculture share has increased from 42% to 45%. And again, yes, the data is from pre-COVID and post-COVID, but even if we adjust it for COVID, an increase from 42.5 to 45% in a sector which would have been impacted equally by COVID, though agriculture has shown a lot of resilience, the basic point is the unorganized sector still holds a lot of the informal, what we call as employees of the manufacturing, which has also declined from 38 million to 30 million. The argument is we are having a reverse structural transformation. This data is coming from the Hindu, and the argument which the Hindu argues is that though we have become from 142 to 63, the ease of doing business index is bogus, according not to me, according to the Hindu, and it is politically motivated, and for 6 years the government kept on in a way trying to get this index down to 63. However, there was no empirical or analytical foundations that the better performance of ease of doing business will actually do something to the manufacturing sector in India. This is the real problem, and this is where this line of this article is going to be very, very important for any question which can come in the examination. It says there is a reversal of structural transformation from a higher to a lower productivity sector in the post-independent India, which is unprecedented, and it is the clearest sign of premature deindustrialization before attaining maturity in the industrial sector. Now, this is where a very interesting word comes through, which is deindustrialization. Now, I'll tell you what this means. See, when I say deindustrialization to you, what will come to your mind is the concept of modern India deindustrialization. Now, in class also, in academic circles, my own articles and my own research argues that this word deindustrialization itself makes no sense. For modern India, the word deindustrialization is itself problematic because it was the handloom industry, if you want to call it an industry. Weavers were in a way were pushed out of the manufacturing sector into the what we call as agriculture sector, and the destruction of the handloom industries in India is called deindustrialization. But the nomenclature is problematic because you don't call something deindustrialization when there is no industrialization. The definition of industrialization is proper factory based production, and then you call it deindustrialization. Therefore, the word deindustrialization in modern India itself is problematic, but we can't help it. That is what the NCERT said, that is what the basic UPSC sources say, not academic sources, but that is what it is. But what this is referring to is a very important point. See, Britain industrialized in 1750, it started its industrialization. By 1850, it became the foremost industrial power, and it has been industrializing and has reached its industrial maturity. Meaning, if we say that if the interwar period just before the Great Depression, we argue that the industrialization of Britain reached its peak. Since we can argue that this will remain till 1945, till the Second World War, most of Europe reached its industrial maturity, which is its industrialization had peaked, its output has peaked. And since Second World War, it has been believed that Europe has been deindustrializing. Europe has been deindustrializing. What does it mean? That whatever positive we see here, it is now in negative, meaning it is losing in its industries. With China rising as the manufacturer of the world, Europe lost its position as the manufacturer of the world, and that is what is called deindustrialization. This is called pure deindustrialization. This is the correct definition of deindustrialization, which is losing your industrial maturity or output and coming down to a lower average in that regard. This is what is called deindustrialization. Europe has done that, and even America, industrial growth has been stagnant, but it is also seen a little bit of deindustrialization. For example, automobile industry is moving out of Detroit is deindustrialization. That is pure deindustrialization. That is the best example of deindustrialization, whereas Detroit used to be the automobile hub of America, and now it is just a deserted town, bankrupt town, and that is where the concept of deindustrialization comes from. Now, what this article is arguing, and it's a very interesting concept, is saying that India is going through a more precarious problem or a precarious phase in that sense. And the problem is that, see, India, if we go by industrial output, India, if its potential was to reach, for example, at this point, was going to reach to this point. For example, let's take it 1 lakh ton of iron was its potential as per its industrial prowess. India never reached it. India never reached its industrial might. Industrial revolution never happened also in India. Industrialization did happen. Without reaching its industrial maturity, according to the data which has been given by the article, India is now going into a deindustrialization phase. And this is coming out of this, which is movement of labor back from manufacturing to agriculture and forestry. This is where the relative increase in the workforce in agriculture is indicative of an unprecedented reverse structural transformation and a premature deindustrialization even before reaching its maturity in the form of an industrial world. See, there are multiple, I personally, or as a, you can say as a researcher, there are a lot of indicators which this data is not taking into consideration. It is not taking into consideration the concept of sustainable development. It is not taking into consideration the concept of green development. It is not taking consideration into the concept of COVID. It is not taking the long term effects of COVID into consideration. It is not looking at the process of mechanization, which is movement away from labor based industries to capital and more you can say machine based industries. It is not taking into consideration AI. It is not taking into consideration a lot of the new technological developments. So, as a labor historian, as an economic historian, this data is, as Hindu is itself, a little bit biased. The argument which it wants to push is this, sure, well taken, but this data is indicative of something at least. If we don't agree with it fully, but if we indicate it vis-a-vis how it is in a way showing us a trend, this is not a very positive trend when it comes to employment data, when it comes to its GDP data generally. This is where this article becomes important, and if the UPSC wants, it can ask you a question like this, and we have remedies for it also, which is India's manufacturing sector is going through premature deindustrialization. Comment. This type of question cannot be answered if you don't understand what is structural transformation, if you don't understand what you mean by deindustrialization truly. Deindustrialization in the context of colonial India is a misnomer. It is a misappropriation of a word called deindustrialization. But deindustrialization purely means reverse structural transformation and losing industries in that regard. This is where the concept becomes important. Now, what the article points out is we can reverse deindustrialization in India as of right now. If we agree to it, you and me as analytical UPSC aspirants, if we agree that there is deindustrialization, how do we change it? First is reimagine industrial policy, align it with the domestic value addition, trade and industrial practices. Now, this is a very big funda which they are saying has no meaning if you really don't understand the market itself. Second, protectionist policies for its own what we call as dynamic sector, not just to promote comparative advantage, and no cash subsidies to increase comparative advantage. The comparative advantage concept is if I can produce a tire in India and I can produce a tire in China, if I have more rubber, it is a comparative advantage to me, and therefore it is saying you should not give subsidies to industries, and this may be referring to the PLI scheme, wherein you create a artificial comparative advantage vis-a-vis a real one. Then R&D needs to be there, research and Indianization of imported technology. Last but not the least is you can have an investment led growth and technological catching up, which is industry. But the point which they don't understand is that the more you make technology driven industries, the less the labor is needed, because you will have a less labor intensive process of manufacturing. That is a separate issue altogether. But the idea is this is the way forward if needed for the examination. There are big fundas in this, you can use it, but do understand that this article is in a way talking about something which may be also true, may not also be true. It has its own agenda, and the agenda is to argue this. However, we can take out some positives, some negatives, but at least a cautionary tale out of it as per going, because the data does not take into account a lot of things. That is where this is a lot of static data with no real comparative data vis-a-vis what the other countries are doing in the same phase, and is it taking into account the shocks which this sector has seen. So, interesting article, important article, can help you in contextualizing your economics better in that regard. With this, let us move to the third topic. This one is an interesting one because coming from a bureaucrat himself, part of the UNEP, part of the UNFCCC, And it talks about 3-4 important lines which can be used by you with regards to the global south. The new buzzword is global south, and the concept of global south, how there's global inequality. Now, this article talks about the summit of the future which recently happened. You would have seen all of these speeches which recently happened. India gave a befitting reply also to Pakistan vis-a-vis taking up the issue of Kashmir in this summit of the future, United Nations important summit. And this article talks about a trend which has emerged, in which, looking at the outlook of the UN, should we focus on great power competition or continuing imbalance in the global sector vis-a-vis global inequality? And the argument is that global justice can only come through when global inequality is taken into consideration. Now, it also talks about 3 initiatives which have been agreed upon. This is very, very, very important for you for the examination, because these can come as a prelims question. What are the initiatives? And this is a very important concept. Global Digital Impact Initiative. Linked to it is the International Scientific Panel on AI and Global Dialogue on AI. The argument here is this is EU driven, wherein open, free, secure digital future which can hold human rights and multi-stakeholder governance forward. This is where there is a need for monitoring the internet, and therefore human rights and a free, open and secure digital space is important. And therefore, that is why AI has been identified as a new horizon, and therefore there needs to be dialogue on AI. The second concept which was talked about was declaration on future generations. This is again UN driven agenda or UN driven basic politics, which is that they are saying that we recognize that any action or inaction we do today is going to affect our future generations, and therefore we need to work. This realization comes after destruction of the environment for the past 5 to 6 decades, and after colonialism and destroying Africa and Asia and the global south. But it's a concept which sounds very good, that whatever we have done, there is a repercussion for future generations. Obviously, there is a repercussion for future generations, and there is more inactivity on global climate finance. It is a impact on future generations for sure. This is where the UN is a drama. This is a drama. This is the biggest drama which they do. Yes, we have impact. We will recognize. Nothing really is going to come out of this. It's just saying that we recognize future generations. UN has been, and most probably will be till it has reforms, a mouthpiece of the US, you can say a toothless dog in the hands of the US, as testimony, as we can see through the testimony of time and through world history itself, has done nothing. It is a multilateral institution which doesn't really recognize the real power centers and the changing world. And this is what this article talks about. It argues that the UN failed to talk about UNFC reform, no Security Council reform consensus came through, no climate finance consensus came through, and the concept which becomes extremely important here is that somehow the G7, which the author points out is nothing but the Second World War countries or all colonial countries, the G7 still is setting the agenda, is still setting the agenda of the world, which makes no sense looking at their population and looking at their GDP data. The argument is very simple, that the poor countries or the third world, it's still trapped in the same matrix, in the same structures which were produced at the time of producing the Bretton Woods twins and the UN in that regard. And therefore, the third world, or now what is called as the global south, it does have a voice, it is gaining a voice, but still does not have the power to set the agenda of development and growth in the world. And this is where the argument is for global governance, for the concept of cooperation, justice, a focus on making it a level playing field and having comparative levels of well-being across the world is very, very, very important. So, the concept is GDP is not the indicator of growth. What is an indicator of growth is comparative well-being. It should be the same across the world. And the problem is that we are still in a place of global inequality. And this is where the way this article points a certain issue out to us is that we somehow believe that India is emerging, we believe that India is emerging, China is emerging as an important stakeholder in world politics. Still, the global south holds only a voice, not the power. And the question which can come out of exactly a line which is given in this article. The foundations of power will remain with the West for few decades, even as the global trend is in favor of global south. This is where you have to argue that it is true to some level that the G6, G7 groups are actually setting the agenda. UNSC reform is not coming through. Climate finance still remains a problem. West still is dictating. Let's see for how long, but only when global equality comes through, there is a place where the global south will at least hold power, and the starting point can be UNSC reform, from where the global south is represented better in the Security Council. In that regard, at least that is the starting point of this whole process. Can be used as a very interesting concept. After this, we have three very simple, straightforward articles. One is the Russia's new nuclear policy. So, not good for anybody. Russia, in the recent context where Zelensky has gone to America, he's secured an $8 billion line of credit and military aid in the form of US based technology and arms and weapons. It is getting a lot, he is getting a lot of you can say weapons and aid from the NATO itself, from separate NATO members also. And recently the Ukrainians pushed into Russia also, captured a sector, nobody said nothing. And now Zelensky is talking about the concept of a victory, a open victory, or at least a victory in some form or the other. Now, Russia recently and Vladimir Putin has, through his, you can say, through his ministers, has pushed out a new doctrine. And the doctrine is, and this is going to be the nuclear doctrine, Russia has been threatening to use nuclear power for a very long time in this war, but for the first time he's institutionalized it. And the idea is that if there is any conventional, a very interesting point, if there is any conventional attack on Russia by any country that is supported by a nuclear power, basically referring to the US or the P5 powers, Russia would consider a joint attack and presumably deal with the threat accordingly. This joint attack means conventional plus nuclear. And this is where, for the first time, when Ukraine is talking about a victory plan, Russia has institutionalized its stance on using nuclear power for hook or crook to win this war, and therefore, the Russian foreign minister using these lines is a problematic development vis-a-vis Russia-Ukraine. Russia has been threatening to use nuclear power, Belarus has been part of this larger complex, but institutionalization of it and putting it out there as a media statement is again taking this to the next level. As of right now, we don't know how serious this concept is, but with Zelensky going in a certain direction, with where he is trying to use heavier machinery, asking for F-16s, this may go into the wrong space. And this is where we have to keep an eye on Russia-Ukraine, which has become second skin after what is happening in West Asia, after what happened yesterday. After this, we have one interesting development where India and our Chief of Army Staff, Admiral D.K. Tripathi, is in Greece. He has talked about the concept of collaboration on the lines of a free and open Indian Ocean and Mediterranean, and thereafter cooperation tackling maritime challenges is something which has been talked about. The question is, This is a very interesting partnership. They're talking about cross training, and bringing in the Mediterranean for India is equally important for any alternative route to the Suez Canal or any alternative route in order to counter China in that regard. Therefore, an interesting straightforward development, nothing really to read into, but something as a part of your notes you can add India-Greece cooperation. Last but not the least is this small article which adds to what we did yesterday, which is China talking about Lebanon's sovereignty. This is where now the Hezbollah attack, Israel attacking Lebanon, and yesterday if you remember we talked about a ground invasion of Israel of Lebanon, is going to be complicated because China has done this in the past, is doing it again. It is trying to act as a mediator, saying that we will not let this get out of hand, but it is also understanding the changing dynamics after the death of Nasrallah, and with Hassan Nasrallah dead and Hezbollah on the back foot, China senses an opportunity. And this is again something which we have to keep an eye out for. Through these CNAs, we will keep on updating you about it, but this is a follow up on something which we have done yesterday. I hope the reverse auction discussion in the beginning was equally enlightening, and with this we will end the session. But do remember, carbon common practice, deindustrialization, structural transformation are very important topics for the examination and may be the game changer for you. I hope that you have also given the test which happened as success in prelims SIP on our platform. The link is given in the description box, which happens on the Unacademy platform. On Saturday, the test goes live. It's a 30 to 40 question test of all current affairs. So you should give that also, and do like, share and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Take care.